Welcome to Tabletop Gaming Guild. Tabletop Gaming Guild is all about the experiences and memories of playing tabletop games that friends and families can create. Today we'll be looking at Pirate Borg, part of the BORG series of games. So I should warn you up front, BORG series tends to be on the mature end. They deal a lot with brutal scenes, morbid elements. Everything tends to be focusing on the end of the world and the downfall of society. So you have to keep that in mind. But this is an RPG, so there is a lot of freedom. It's completely up to the person running the game on how they want to cater the story, so they could, take all those elements, tame them down to be suitable for their play group. That said, I have run a game of BORG on the channel, and I think I did a fairly good job of keeping it relatively family friendly. So what is Pirate Borg? As they say, Pirate Borg is a game of grog-swilling pirates, undead galleons, arcane treasures found in ancient temples, and high seas adventures. It's not a game about slavery, sexual violence, genocide, or any other abhorrent, real parts of history. Please treat these topics with the respect they deserve, or leave them out of the game altogether and go hunt for skeletons. So basically, there's two versions of piracy, and you gotta keep that in mind. There is the fantasy that most people seem to enjoy, of pirates being out to enjoy life and just have freedom and fun and adventure. And there's the reality of history where they were doing pretty horrible things, and we want to stay away from that and keep it towards the fantasy. That said, again, we're having to deal with adult themes here, so there is drinking involved, carousing, and of course violence and murder. If you're comfortable with that, there is a lot of potential for stupid things happening because they're out of sorts, leading to a long chain of events and all sorts of wild things. One of the things that BORG series is good at is giving you a lot of potential for the system itself to kick off what's happening and give you inspiration on where to go. So that's why they give you all sorts of charts like this, where you can just roll and let it randomly decide for you what is the outcome of this decision they made. And there's a lot of very evocative language that really can help to build a story. You can, find somebody that's passed out and loot from them, and find this deck of playing cards that's all mermaids, and that could lead you off to an adventure where you're finding some mermaid settlement or some little town in the middle of the ocean that reveres the mermaids. Whatever you want to do with that, but I can see a lot of potential there. Glancing through this book, you can very clearly see it is set in basically an alternative version of real historic Caribbean. One of the things that I thought was really cool is this history of the Dark Caribbean. It gives you a full timeline of what's happening in the world around you, and you can use that as a key part of your story, or it could be just something to keep in mind and those background elements, and think about how that could affect your relatively unrelated story that you're having away from major events. I do briefly want to address Ash, because it is referred to a lot in this book, and it's not an element I'm terribly comfortable with. Anything to do with drug use where it could potentially be seen as positive, I don't really appreciate. Yes, there is definitely a strong potential for negative outcomes, including death from the use of these chemicals, but I would probably just completely avoid this and take it out of my game. Back to more positive elements of this game. the character creation. In all Morkborg, I like the character creations. It's straightforward, it's fast. You could create your characters in a few minutes and have relatively depthy characters and avoid having to spend an entire sessions going through developing everybody's characters. No, just let the dice determine who your character is. The gear that you roll for can have a massive influence on who your character is, because whether they have a fishing rod or a med kit, or where they have some ancient runes and some candles, can really tell you what your character is interested in. And then rolling for your stats, of course, can also have a huge effect. You can do the presets, but I prefer to roll randomly. So you just basically roll for each stat, 46, drop the lowest number, and then total that and determine what your modifier is. So roll, if you rolled a 15 or 16, you're going to have +2 to anything on that stat. And the system is basically built around these difficulty ratings. The players are going to be doing almost all the rolling in this game, and the DM is just deciding how difficult that task is, and the characters are trying to roll above that. And combat is also relatively simple. The only thing the DM is going to roll is for the initiative, and it's rolling basically on whether the players go first or the enemies. And when it comes to the player's turn, they decide among themselves, usually based on a die roll, what their turn initiative is going to be. Players are going to be rolling for their attacks, as well as when they're attacked by enemies, they're rolling for defense. So that frees the DM up to tell a story. They don't have to worry about rolling and doing all the math. Let the players do that. You are just there to take those rolls and elaborate on them and build them into a cohesive event. Much of Morkborg is built around that. It's the idea of that the DM there is there to tell the story. The rolling and all the stats are just there for the players to interact with that story. The more the book, the rule set can free the DM up to tell the best story he can, the better. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of potential. It gives you a lot of ability to roll for different outcomes. So the emphasis tends to be on heavy improvisation, which I do enjoy. But the other through line in all Morkborg games is they can be punishing. If you are knocked out, it's not just, oh, cast a spell and they pop up and they're completely fine as if nothing had happened. No, there's potential for long-term permanent effects every time you're knocked out, including potential for instant death. This isn't a game that's designed for one-shots or relatively short campaigns. Your characters will die in this game, so you have to be ready for that. Leveling up, pretty incremental. It's not going to be the huge jumps that you would get in other RPGs. Preset characters, as I said, I don't really bother with us in these series, but there's plenty of options. There is the potential of magic, but in this universe, magic can be dangerous. They can have adverse side effects. They can completely not work. They could do terrible things, hurt not only your enemies, but everybody around them. Devil's Luck exists in some form or another in every Morkborg game. After every long rest, you're given a certain amount of points to spend towards mitigating bad luck. It doesn't give you a lot of these, which is a good thing. You don't want to give too many and then lose that potential for failure. Because failure can actually be really interesting for a story, as well as success is a lot less impactful if it doesn't feel like there's a chance of failure. If you're struggling to get depth to your character, this gives you a lot of options for that. You can roll for backgrounds, you can roll for flaws or distinctive features, as well as idiosyncrasy and things that have happened to them in the past. So you can let the system help you build a interesting and depthy character. Probably not so important if you're planning to do a one-shot, but if you're doing a short series of games, this could really be useful. And then from the DM's perspective, you have the same thing, having trouble with where the story should go next or how to get your characters from one place to the other. You can just roll for random incidents that may help lead you to where you want to go, or just give you an entire new storyline to follow. I really like that piece of art. It almost looks like a Turner. But anyways, naval combat does make me a little nervous. It can be slow and cumbersome if not handled right, but you're not looking at ships with massive hit points. And the morale system in combat, which I haven't mentioned yet, can really impact that, because one of the key things in BORG is there are certain events in each combat that could trigger a loss of morale among the enemies, could cause them to flee or surrender, so it could end combat early. It doesn't always have to end with the complete annihilation of your enemies. So yeah, even though if you're not necessarily having to knock down the ship to 0 hit points every time, no, you could just do enough damage to slow it down or cause the ship to surrender, or just get it so you can actually send a boarding party. And now you're doing with hand-to-hand combat, which can go pretty quickly. Most of these ships don't have a lot of hit points. It's a little awkward the way they deal with it. Most damage done by weapons is 1/5 of what they would do to a person, so it's a little misleading. Really, the health of these is really 5 times what they say on the sheet. The other interesting element of these ships is it essentially gives you another way of leveling up your characters, because leveling up as far as your physical attributes is really slow. You're mostly going to be leveling up by getting better gear, better ships, and be better able to handle whatever scenario is thrown at you. My only concern with that is, like anything that's where leveling is based on gear and physical things that you can acquire, if you lose those things, it can be pretty devastating. Enemies in this game take many forms. Lots of animals you can end up encountering. It's like dark versions of all the real world animals. The mouth of cows and corpses, deadly plants. Or you can create your own characters, and of course there are human and formerly human enemies you can deal with. So lots of different enemies. If your DM is particularly mean, they could put you up against some abominations from the depth. But more likely you're going to be dealing with living weapons and enemy captains as well as their crews. Well, that's at least early on. And with all encounters in BORG, you can give, as a DM, you can give the players what you think is fair based on the level of the encounter, or you can roll to randomly decide what they get, which also gives you opportunities to redirect the story or to keep building the story. Various items that can pick up can trigger an entire new storyline, or you can just use these plot twists. The key thing that is throughout all the BORG games, taking as much of the work that the DM has to do and giving you options of having the system do it for you to allow you to focus on the story. These treasure maps concepts are really cool. So not only does it allow you to like roll to see what might be on the treasure maps, you could basically use this to make a physical map. Lastly, this gives you a pretty substantial module. This Curse of the Skeleton Point, it gives you the plot hooks, it gives you all these characters you can interact with, many locations. So I get the impression this is meant to be an entire series of games. It's supposed to be a small campaign, not a one-shot. Finally, we have the character creation sheet. There's a fair amount on this, but this is really just walking you through how to create your character. And the other really great thing I love about the BORG series is you have this one-page player aid that you can give out and tell those players pretty much everything they need to know to be able to play this game. It's a pretty impressive feat that you could get so much onto such little space, especially when so many RPGs get so complicated, and you have generally it's almost essential for the players to have read through a player handbook. Speaking of player handbooks, there is also a player handbook. It's pretty much the same elements, except of course it takes out what enemies and locations you can end up in. Last thing I want to cover is the actual character sheet. It looks nice, but I think the layout unfortunately makes it a little bit harder to read. But there is a little bit more to it than there was in regular BORG. You have your weapons, you have your character information, your stats, equipment, relics. Then I'll share information for your ship. If you want to save some ink, there is, of course, printer-friendly version, which is nice that they thought of that. Also, actually, I think this is probably going to be easier to read. Well, that is Pirate BORG. I am interested to try out this game. I do love the BORG system. It is so fun and easy to use for a DM's perspective, as well as the players. But really, if they have this one-page reference sheet in front of them, they just roll to make their characters, they can be playing this within 5 minutes. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to check us out on other social media such as Instagram and Facebook. And don't forget to like and subscribe.